Hello, my YouTube family, and a special shout out to all my night owls and young listeners. I'm Crime Whispers. I know many of you drift off to sleep listening to these stories. So before your eyelids get heavy, I'd love for you to leave a comment telling me where in the world you're tuning in from. If you're enjoying tonight's case, don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. One, we're heading back to Las Vegas, a city that truly never sleeps at any given hour. Something is happening here: bright lights, high stakes, and endless possibilities. Over 500,000 people call it home, and one of them was Shauna Tiaface Hanna. Grew up in a Mormon family in Salt Lake City, Utah. By 1994, at 28 years old, she was ready for a fresh start and made the 500-mile move to Las Vegas. She worked in high-end retail for a while, selling cosmetics at Saks Fifth Avenue in Neiman Marcus. But the allure of the city's nightlife quickly caught her attention. She loved the sparkle, the energy, and the opportunities it promised. She transitioned into working as a cocktail waitress, first at the Fiesta, and eventually landing a coveted position at the prestigious Palms Hotel and Casino. Shauna fit in instantly. Her coworkers became like family. Customers adored her, and her laughter was as much a part of the atmosphere as the ringing slot machines. Friends described her as a free spirit with an unshakable positive outlook. No matter the situation. In 2002, Shauna met George Tiaface at the Palms. George was a regular there, and he noticed Shauna right away. Always busy, always smiling, always making guests feel welcome. George had been a star athlete and homecoming king in high school, later training at the United States Military Academy at West Point. By the time they met, he was working as a firefighter. Friends and family described him as charismatic, funny, and always willing to help. The attraction between them was instant. Soon, they were inseparable. George told his sister Shauna was his whole world. A year later, their world expanded when they welcomed a baby girl, Madison. George was protective of his family, and Shauna was over the moon about being a mother. A few years later, they married in a beautiful beach ceremony in Hawaii. For a while, life seemed picture perfect until George suffered a devastating financial blow during the housing market crash. With much of his savings gone, Shauna became the primary breadwinner. The financial strain began to chip away at their marriage. Shauna confided in friends that George had grown jealous and resentful. His behavior became more controlling. One day, in front of their young daughter, George cruelly told Shauna she looked like a slut on her way to work. He also began spending time with a homeless man, hiring him for odd jobs around the house, someone Shauna found deeply unsettling. As tensions escalated, Shauna moved into her own townhouse in Summerlin. They shared custody of Maddie and attended marriage counseling. Shauna still hoped for reconciliation, but admitted divorce was becoming a real possibility. In a text to George, she wrote, "Once we live separate, I don't think there's any going back." George, meanwhile, told others he dreaded the complications divorce would bring. Shauna was adjusting to her new routine, still working long hours, still loving her job. But then, one night after a late shift, she came home to find her apartment had been broken into. The place was a mess. Her engagement ring, along with several sentimental items, was gone. Oddly, the thief had taken her bikini bottoms and left behind a pair of boxer briefs. The incident left her shaken, but she tried to move forward. Then came the night. Everything changed after finishing a 3 a.m. shift. Shauna drove home, a 30-minute trip, and pulled into her garage around 3:30. Meanwhile, George, fresh from a fire department shift, had picked up Maddie from her grandmother's house. They drove to Shauna's to collect Maddie's things. When George and Maddie entered the townhouse, they found chaos. The home had been completely ransacked, and on the floor was Shauna Tiaface. 911 dispatcher, do you know what the address is? And you don't live there, correct? George, no, my wife and I live in separate places. Dispatcher, okay. When's the last time you saw her? 911 dispatcher, how long has it been since you last saw her? George, I'm a fireman. I was at work yesterday, so I guess about 36 hours ago, a day and a half. Something like that, dispatcher. How old is your daughter? George. She's 8, dispatcher, and she's with you now. George. Yes, she's right here, dispatcher. What's your name, sir? George. George Tiafe, dispatcher. Do you see anything suspicious around her? Any weapons? Knives, guns? George. No, I had to get my daughter out of there. We came over. The garage door was open, and it's never open. We went inside to grab some of my daughter's things. My wife sleeps during the day because she works at night, and she was on the floor when we walked in, dispatcher. Where are you right now? George. At the garage, dispatcher. Okay, we have an officer on the way. Just stay outside. Medical is also on the way, George. I didn't touch the body to check for a pulse, dispatcher. That's okay. They'll handle that from the position of the blood in Shauna's body. Investigators could tell she had been attacked as she went upstairs. Her injuries suggested the weapon was likely a hammer she had fought desperately, breaking her fingers in the struggle. But the blows to her head were so severe that paramedics initially believed she had been shot. A neighbor later reported hearing a series of heavy thuds between 3:30 and 4 a.m. But since Shauna normally arrived home around that time, nothing seemed unusual at the moment. Soon after, another neighbor found Shauna's phone, her health card, and some of her makeup scattered along the side of a nearby road, an ominous sign that her killer may have tried to dispose of evidence while fleeing, as in most homicide investigations. Shauna's estranged husband George was interviewed first. He had been at the fire station the day before, working a 24-hour shift. Colleagues confirmed his alibi, leaving detectives puzzled. Was the break-in from 3 weeks earlier connected to her murder? Or was it a terrifying coincidence? Could this be a targeted killing? Or was it a burglary gone wrong? The thought of a predator targeting women working late-night casino shifts left Shauna's co-workers deeply unsettled, but Shauna's sister Paula wasn't buying the random robbery theory. She and her husband had spoken with Shauna countless times about the tension in her marriage, and something about George's demeanor didn't sit right. Paula called him directly, but George handed the phone to a grief counselor at the scene. Paula was blunt, telling them exactly what she suspected, and within hours, she and her husband booked the first flight to Las Vegas. The thought of what Shauna endured haunted Paula. The sheer pain, the terror, the moment her sister must have realized she was going to die then, just 24 hours after Shauna's body was found. Police got the tip that cracked the case wide open. A man known as Big Will came forward, telling detectives that a homeless acquaintance, known only as Greyhound, had confessed to killing a woman with a hammer. Disturbingly, Greyhound wasn't frightened or remorseful. He was laughing, as if proud of what he'd done. Big Will told him that if he ever saw a murder on the news matching that description, he'd go straight to the police. When Shauna's story broke, Big Will kept his word. Greyhound, whose real name was Noel Stevens, was living in a tent on the outskirts of Las Vegas. Big Will explained that Noel often stole food from a nearby Albert grocery store and sold drugs at a gas station across the street. Police used Big Will's help to track him down. It didn't take long. They spotted Noel at one of his usual haunts. When approached, he had drugs on him, giving officers an immediate reason to arrest him while they investigated the murder. Lead Noel Stevens was already known to police for petty theft and drug offenses, but he flatly denied killing Shauna. Detectives found it strange. Noel was a low-level criminal, the kind who might snatch a purse, not travel miles to commit a brutal murder for nothing of real value. Something didn't add up. There was no clear connection between Noel and Shauna until officers searched the area around his tent, deep in a secluded stretch of desert. The search party moved quietly through the remote patch of desert where Noel's tent was pitched. It was the kind of place only the desperate or the hidden would choose, miles from the nearest road, shrouded in brush, with nothing but the sound of wind sweeping over sand among the scattered debris of his makeshift camp. Detectives began finding items that stopped them cold. First, a pair of women's sunglasses, then a compact mirror, small, everyday objects that to most, might seem insignificant, but they matched descriptions of things Shauna had owned. Then came the most damning discovery. Clothing pieces that matched what Shauna had been missing after her first break-in, even the bikini bottoms taken from her apartment weeks before. It was becoming harder for Noelle to deny knowing anything about Shauna. The chance of a random homeless man having these exact items, and them not being connected, was shrinking to zero when confronted with the evidence. Noel stuck to his story. He hadn't killed anyone. He said he claimed he'd found some of the items while scavenging, but his demeanor, much like when he allegedly confessed to Big Will, was disturbingly casual. Still, one question gnawed at detectives. Why Shauna? Noelle had no history with her, no mutual acquaintances, no reason to target her, unless someone else had given him one, and that's when the case took its darkest turn. Through a series of interviews and phone record checks, police learned that Noelle hadn't been acting alone. In fact, there was someone who had not only known about Shauna's schedule, her routines, and the layout of her townhouse, but who had a deep, personal reason to want her gun. Someone who had been in her life for years, someone she had once trusted with everything. The desert where Noelle Stevens had set up camp stretched endlessly in every direction, a barren, wind-blown expanse where anything could vanish forever. Officers worried that finding usable evidence could take weeks, but Noelle hadn't gone far to dispose of incriminating items. Just a short walk from his tent, they found them: a pair of trousers, stained with blood, a price tag from a hammer, and a pair of blood-soaked underwear back at the station. Detectives combed through Noelle's phone. Among the scattered contacts, one name stood out. George. When asked who George was, Noelle's answer connected everything. That's my friend, the firefighter. This was the very same man Shauna had been worried about from the moment she met him. The friend her estranged husband had brought into her life. Investigators traced the hammer's barcode to a local store, pulling the surveillance footage. They were stunned. The security cameras showed George Tiafe and Noelle Stevens together, walking through the aisles, buying the very hammer that would later be used to kill Shauna. At this point, police were convinced George wasn't just connected to the crime, he was at the center of it. When confronted with the evidence, Noelle finally broke. Yes, he admitted, he had killed Shauna, but, he claimed, it was George who had orchestrated everything and paid him $600 to do it. According to Noelle, the plan had been in motion for weeks. George had a duplicate key made for him, bought him dark clothing, and even arranged for a break-in weeks earlier as a practice run on September 29th. Noelle said he broke into Shauna's townhouse and hid in her closet for a time. When she arrived home, he moved into the living room, waiting as Shauna headed upstairs. Noelle followed, then attacked. Shauna screamed, crying and begging for her life. Why are you doing this? But Noelle struck her again and again, 17 times in total. When the hammer's handle broke, he continued using the hammerhead until she stopped moving. He later led police into the desert, to the spot where he had buried the hammerhead. They finally had the murder weapon 9 days after Shauna's body was found. On October 8th, detectives informed George's mother and sister that he was now a suspect in her death. Both were horrified, certain he was innocent. Minutes later, George's sister called him, and George immediately got into his truck. What followed was a reckless, high-speed drive through Las Vegas that ended with him slamming head-on into a concrete wall at more than 80 miles per hour. There were no skid marks, no sign he'd even tried to stop. It was a deliberate crash. George survived only because he was wearing a seatbelt. He was taken to University Medical Center, treated for his injuries. 2 days later, officers entered his hospital room to inform him he was under arrest. His response was a calm, almost detached "Okay then." He asked if he could call his lawyer, take a shower, and brush his teeth with. Noelle's confession, the hammerhead, and the damning CCTV footage. Prosecutors were confident they had enough to charge both men. 3 months later, Noelle Stevens pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and agreed to testify against George as the prosecution's star witness. He was sentenced to 42 years to life in prison in August 2015. George, still pleading not guilty, walked into the courtroom for the start of his trial. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. George had conspired with a homeless man to murder his wife, Shauna. In cold blood, jurors heard the chilling details of how Noel had waited for her return, then struck her over and over with a hammer in the gallery. Shauna's family sat through every moment, dressed in her favorite color, pink. They gave lead prosecutor Mark DiGiacomo her lucky poker chip to keep with him during the trial. George never took the stand in his own defense, but friends and family testified on his behalf, painting him as a kind, hard-working man. Incapable of such a crime, the prosecution countered with an avalanche of evidence. The surveillance footage, Noel's detailed account, and phone records showing George had called Noel 87 times in September 2012, including 5 calls the night before the murder, for a man who supposedly only did the occasional odd job. That was a staggering number of calls. The defense tried to argue that the CCTV footage proved nothing, that George and Noel were simply buying tools. The defense insisted that the hammer purchase was nothing more than an innocent errand. They suggested that Noel, a volatile and desperate man, had acted alone, spinning a story about George's involvement to save his own life. But prosecutors had more than just Noel's word. They had the pattern phone records placed George and Noel in constant communication in the weeks leading up to the murder. There were also calls made immediately before and after Shauna's death. Calls that prosecutors argued were made to coordinate the attack and confirm its success. Then came Noel's testimony sitting in the witness box. The man who had killed Shauna with his own hands described how George had planned everything, from the practiced burglary to the choice of weapon. He spoke of George's bitterness over the separation, his resentment over finances, and his fear of losing custody of Maddie. Noel told the jury about the $600 payment, a figure prosecutors emphasized not for its amount, but for its meaning. The life of Shauna Tiafe, they argued, had been reduced to the cost of a few weeks' grocery set, was a detail that visibly shook Shauna's family. The trial stretched on for days, with the prosecution methodically dismantling the defense's claims, and when it was time for closing arguments, lead prosecutor Mark DiGiacomo held up Shauna's lucky poker chip, the one her family had given him at the start, and told the jury this chip was her good luck. But on September 29, 2012, her luck ran out, because the person she should have been able to trust the most made sure it did. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. When they returned, the courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that swallows even the sound of breathing. George Tiafe stared straight ahead as the foreperson read the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, burglary, and conspiracy. Shauna's family broke down in tears. For them, justice had been served, but it came at the cost of knowing that the father of Shauna's daughter had orchestrated her brutal death. George was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole in the years since. Shauna's friends and family have worked to keep her memory alive. Her daughter Maddie, now grown, carries the weight of losing her mother in such a violent way, and of knowing her father was responsible. They remember Shauna as vibrant, compassionate, and full of life, a woman who loved her work, her friends, and most of all, her daughter. And as the lights of Las Vegas continue to shine through the night, the story of Shauna Tiafe stands as a haunting reminder. Even in the city that never sleeps, danger can come from the person you trust most. Noel continued doing odd jobs for George, and when he took the witness stand, he repeated almost word for word the same account he had given police years earlier. Prosecutor: how did you meet George? Noel: I was sitting out front one day, smoking a cigarette and having a drink, when he walked by with his dog. That's how we first met. Prosecutor: when you first met him, what kind of communication did you have? What kind of relationship, if you can call it that, developed? Noel: I told him I did yard work and similar jobs. He hired me to do some work. Prosecutor: How long would you say you've known George? Noel. A few years, prosecutor. And how would you describe your relationship? At that point, strictly work. Noel. We were friends, the two would sometimes work out together. But Noel also noticed tension between George and Shauna, prosecutor, when you visited. How was George's relationship with Shauna? Noel. Bad. They argued a lot about all kinds of things. Mostly money, George told me. She spent too much eventually. The conversations took a darker turn. Prosecutor. At some point, were you asked to do something at the second house related to the divorce? Noel. Yeah, kill Shauna when George first brought it up. Noel didn't take him seriously. George had offered him $1,000, but Noel refused, thinking he was just blowing off steam. But then George raised the offer to $5,000, promising to pay after he collected the insurance money in addition to the $600 in cash George had already given him. Noel admitted he made extra money by stealing and pawning Shauna's engagement ring. He also claimed George promised him tens of thousands more once the murder was done. Detectives believed Noel even called George from a gas station the day after the killing, possibly to arrange the rest of the payment, but that meeting never happened because investigators had already made contact with him. Noel testified that George had told him to use a fiberglass hammer because a wooden one might break, despite bringing both. Noel ended up using the wooden hammer, which did break during the attack. Prosecutor. What happened when she came through the garage? Noel. I waited until she walked past the door, then I came out with the hammer. He explained that the hammer had been purchased at Lowe's and kept at his camp. He didn't use the fiberglass one because, as he put it, I didn't want to buy another one. Prosecutor. And why not use the wooden hammer, knowing it could break? Noel. George told me it would break, but I used it anyway. Prosecutor. What happened when you came out the door? Noel. She asked, why are you doing this? I was wearing a mask. So she didn't know who I was. I didn't say anything. I just hit her in the head. Shauna collapsed, and Noel jumped on top of her, striking her repeatedly until the hammer snapped. He then threw away the wooden handle, grabbed the metal head, and continued the assault. The prosecution argued that Noel's story matched phone records, CCTV footage, and the timeline of events, but during cross-examination, Noel admitted he experienced both auditory and visual hallucinations, giving the defense ammunition to suggest he might have fabricated George's involvement entirely. George's attorney, Robert Langford, told the jury, "It's a good story, but that's all it is. There's no need to piece it together that way unless you want to." The defense didn't deny that Noel killed Shauna. They simply claimed the idea George was behind it was a lie. Yet prosecutors countered that Noel looked up to George, saw him as a close friend, and was easily manipulated, and, they said, George was the only one with a real motive to see Shauna dead. They argued George was the only person with a motive to see Shauna dead, her life insurance policy with a payout waiting on the other side of her death. Prosecutors said George sought an opportunity and exploited Noel's loyalty to carry it out. The state's theory was simple. George planted the idea, offered money, and guided Noel through the planning, right down to suggesting the type of hammer to use. Noel, already struggling with mental health issues, was an easy target. All George had to do was nudge him toward the act. The defense, however, tried to dismantle this narrative. They painted Noel as an unreliable narrator, pointing to his history of hallucinations, erratic behavior, and substance abuse. If Noel's grasp on reality was questionable, how could the jury believe his account of George's involvement? They admitted Noel committed the killing. That much wasn't up for debate, but insisted George had nothing to do with it. Their version. Noel acted alone, either out of his own disordered thinking or some personal grievance he never shared. The defense described Noel's testimony as a good story, carefully crafted to fit the timeline the prosecution wanted, but lacking solid, irrefutable proof of George's role. Meanwhile, the prosecution reminded the jury that this story aligned almost perfectly with the hard evidence, surveillance footage, phone records, the stolen engagement ring, and Noel's actions immediately after the murder. They argued that hallucinations didn't explain those coincidences only. George's orchestration was the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with a dozen new friends. Franny worked at a local restaurant where she was beloved by customers and coworkers alike outside of work. She was deeply devoted to her family, especially her younger siblings, and had a tight-knit group of friends who often gathered for barbecues, lake trips, and karaoke nights. But behind her bubbly personality, Franny had endured her share of hardships. She had been in and out of difficult relationships, some of which were marked by controlling behavior and manipulation. In early 2014, she had been trying to rebuild her life after ending one such relationship, moving into her own apartment and working toward a more independent future. Friends said she seemed optimistic about the changes she was making, determined to focus on her own happiness and to put the past behind her. Unfortunately, that past wasn't ready to let her go. It was around this time that she crossed paths with a man named Chris Perrin, a figure whose charm could quickly turn dark. He was older than Franny and had a reputation in the community that was far from spotless. Some saw him as a smooth talker. Others knew him for his temper and a history of deceit. First, their relationship seemed casual, just a few dates here and there. But friends noticed red flags almost immediately. Chris was possessive, quick to anger, and seemed to appear wherever Franny went. When confronted about it, he brushed it off as just caring about her safety. By late summer, Franny confided to a friend that she was considering cutting ties with Chris for good. She wanted distance, space, and time to breathe without someone constantly monitoring her. But Chris wasn't the type to let go quietly, and soon, her decision to step away would set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. On the night of September 13th, 2014, Franny had plans to meet up with friends at a local bar in Jackson. She seemed in good spirits, laughing, dancing, and talking about a weekend trip she wanted to take. But sometime after midnight, Chris showed up. Witnesses later told police that his presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Franny's friends noticed her body language shift. She became quieter, more guarded. Chris tried to pull her aside multiple times, and at one point they were seen arguing near the entrance around closing time. Franny told her friends she was fine and would see them later, but several people saw her leave the parking lot with Chris. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, Franny's mother tried calling her, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered by afternoon. Worry turned to panic, and her family contacted police to report her missing. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Chris Perrin. He claimed he had dropped Franny off at her apartment in the early hours of the morning and hadn't seen her since. But his story didn't sit right with detectives, especially when they learned Chris was on parole for fraud-related charges and had a history of violent altercations with women. 2 days into the search, police made a grim discovery. Franny's body was found in a secluded, wooded area near a riverbank. Just outside Jackson, she had been beaten and strangled. Detectives believed she had been killed the same night. She vanished. Forensic evidence pointed squarely to Chris Perrin. Fibers from his vehicle matched fibers found on Franny's clothing, and cell phone records placed him at the scene where her body was dumped. When confronted with the evidence, Chris tried to shift the blame, claiming that an unknown man had attacked them both and that he had fled in fear. The jury didn't buy it. After a 2-week trial filled with emotional testimony, including friends describing Franny's final hours and experts detailing the brutality of her injuries, Chris Perrin was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Franny Spemley later started a memorial foundation in her name, aimed at raising awareness about the dangers of domestic violence and supporting women trying to leave controlling relationships. Every year on her birthday, they gather at the lake she loved so much, releasing lanterns into the night sky as a reminder of the light she brought into their lives. Franny was the kind of person people instantly connected with. Warm, approachable, and the type who made you feel like you'd known her for years. She was endlessly generous, always willing to help anyone she met, and the kind words people had for her seemed endless as a devoted mother to two little girls, aged 5 and 3, and someone juggling 2 jobs. Franny's life was anything but slow. Friends remembered how much she had always loved the idea of marriage. She talked about her dream wedding long before she had even met the right person in 2012. After separating from her daughter's father, Franny met 29-year-old Eric Wolf. He was divorced, with a young daughter named Alexis, and the families blended easily. 2 years later, they moved in together when Eric proposed. Franny was over the moon. Diving into wedding plans with excitement, a friend recalled how she jokingly embraced the bridezilla title, laughing her way through the preparations with the big day just a month away. The couple had even bought a house, ready to start their new chapter, but on August 10th, 2014, everything changed around 6:30 a.m. Eric returned from his 12-hour night shift and fell asleep downstairs hours later. His daughter came running to wake him, terrified after finding Franny unresponsive. On the bedroom floor, she was cold to the touch. The children were quickly taken out of the house. The area was taped off, and word began to spread. Friends gathered outside, clinging to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding or a cruel rumor. But inside, the scene was horrific enough to unsettle even the most experienced detectives. Franny had been stabbed 90 times. She lay between the bed and the wall, with 2 cable ties around each wrist, suggesting she had been restrained before being cut loose. Police described the attack as pure overkill. An explosion of rage. Her smashed phone was found outside, possibly dropped by the killer or hurled against a tree to destroy it. The manner of her death was immediately ruled a homicide, but the details were kept from the public. Investigators sent the cable ties and other evidence to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab. Naturally, their first step was to question the person closest to her, Eric. From the start, detectives were unsettled by his demeanor. He didn't appear shocked, angry, or even outwardly upset. As the interview wrapped up, he made another offhand remark that struck them as odd. Eric's work records showed he had clocked out at 6:30 a.m., but not every exit at his workplace had surveillance cameras. Could he have slipped out unnoticed, committed the murder, and returned without detection? Franny's friends admitted they weren't entirely convinced Eric was the right man for her. Some began suspecting him immediately, but Eric firmly denied any involvement, claiming he was devastated and struggling to process her death because the situation was unclear. Franny's daughters and Eric's daughter were temporarily placed with relatives on August 15th. What would have been Franny's 29th birthday, grief weighed heavily on everyone. Her co-workers pooled their tips to help pay for funeral expenses. Franny wasn't someone who had enemies. She never held grudges, and no one could imagine anyone wanting to harm her, especially not in such a brutal way. Police then began looking into her workplace, recalling an incident in which she confronted young shoplifters. Their mother attacked Franny, leaving her injured and deeply shaken. That woman's criminal record made her easy to track down, but she had a solid alibi. Detectives also spoke to an old boyfriend who had recently moved back to the area, but he had no information to offer a former roommate. Ryan vouched for Eric's character, saying he saw no problems in their relationship with few leads left. Investigators knew their case now hinged on forensic evidence, something that would take time. Eric remained their primary person of interest when Franny's funeral took place. The turnout was enormous. The prosecutor even noted that her mail carrier attended because she had made such an impact on them, a testament to how loved Frances Craig truly was. But beneath the grief, the community felt a lingering unease. Her killer was still out there, and no one knew who to trust. By now, 3 months had passed since Franny's death, and the last pieces of evidence from the crime scene had finally been processed. What investigators discovered would send the case spiraling in a direction no one had anticipated. On the cable ties used to bind Franny, DNA was found, but it didn't belong to Eric, nor to anyone previously questioned. Instead, it matched a convicted murderer, 43-year-old Cortez Butler, recently released on parole after serving 25 years for second-degree murder. Detectives were stunned. Cortez had no apparent link to Franny. He didn't live in the area, had never worked with her, and there was no shared connection they could see. Was this as simple as him handling those cable ties in some unrelated warehouse job? Or was it something far more sinister, perhaps a murder? Investigators contacted Cortez's parole officer and obtained his phone records. They revealed frequent contact with two men, Rodney McKay, a well-known heroin dealer with a lengthy rap sheet, and Rodney's uncle, Clifford McKay, who had served 20 years for murder. Cortez's location wasn't hard to track down. He was already back in custody, arrested for the killing of 79-year-old Charles Graham after a dispute over pills and money. When detectives asked him about Franny, he didn't deny it. In fact, he admitted outright to killing her, agreeing to share everything on one condition: the interview could not be recorded. It was a risky move, but desperate for answers, police agreed. When asked if Eric Wolf had orchestrated the crime, Cortez flatly denied it. The real mastermind, he claimed, was Rodney McKay. Unfolded was a twisted tale that began months earlier. In March 2014, an apartment in Jackson was set ablaze. Police quickly arrested Rodney, charging him with arson and carrying a concealed weapon. The fire was targeted at a woman named Donna. After she refused to sell drugs for him, Donna and her son were left homeless, and her son turned out to be Ryan, a former roommate of Franny and Eric, who had already spoken to investigators. Ryan didn't live with them for long, moving out shortly after, and by June 2014, Franny and Eric had found a new home. But before Rodney's arson trial, he reached out to his uncle Clifford, determined to track down Ryan and have him killed so he couldn't testify. Clifford, in turn, contacted Cortez Butler, an acquaintance from prison, and offered $10,000 for the hit. The only address they had for Ryan was Franny and Eric's. Cortez told police he entered the house through the unlocked garage, crept upstairs, and saw the children asleep in their rooms. He found Franny in bed, bound her with cable ties, and covered her eyes when he demanded to know Ryan's whereabouts. She told him she didn't know. Cortez then stabbed her at least 20 times in the neck before continuing his brutal attack. Prosecutors described Franny as the very definition of collateral damage, an entirely innocent victim who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The case also sent chills through Ryan, who now knew that someone had gone to such horrifying lengths to silence him, even after killing the wrong person. The trio continued stalking him until Cortez's arrest prevented another attempt in September 1st, 2015. Cortez pleaded no contest to second-degree murder in Charles Graham's case and received 25 to 40 years in prison. Just a month later, Cortez, Rodney, and Clifford were all charged with open murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and first-degree home invasion. The MCs also faced charges for soliciting murder. Thankfully for prosecutors, officers who had been present during Cortez's off-record confession were allowed to testify about it. Phone records placed Clifford and Cortez together in the Jackson area at the time of Franny's murder, and they had exchanged over 200 calls in the days surrounding it. In total, investigators combed through more than 8,000 pages of phone data during trial. Cortez smirked at cameras, laughed, and bragged about his crimes on the stand, until Franny's case came up. Then, he shifted into flat denial, as if trying to maintain control of the narrative. Ultimately, the jury found 27-year-old Rodney McKay, 49-year-old Clifford McKay, and 43-year-old Cortez Butler guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and first-degree home invasion. The MCs were also convicted of soliciting murder. Brother Danny, who described her as fun-loving, caring, and fiercely protective of those she loved. Gemma wasn't just known to her family. She was recognized by millions in the UK as an actress from the popular soap opera EastEnders. She'd appeared on the show in 2001 as Carrie Skinner, a love interest for Robbie Jackson, before deciding to leave acting to pursue other ambitions by 2012. She was working as a bar manager and had a busy social life filled with friends, nights out, and charity work, but despite the public persona of glamour and confidence, Gemma's home life was far more complicated. She lived with her brother Tony, who had a volatile temper and a history of drug abuse. Friends later said that while Gemma had always tried to help him, the relationship between the siblings was strained. Tony could be controlling, and tensions in the household had been escalating for months. On March 1st, 2012, Gemma attended the world premiere of the Best Exotic Marigold Hotel with friends, enjoying what seemed like an ordinary evening, but just hours later, she vanished. Friends and family became concerned almost immediately. Gemma was known for being in constant contact with her loved ones, and it was unlike her to disappear without a word. Her phone had gone dead, and there were no signs she'd planned to go anywhere. 5 days later, the discovery in the canal changed everything. The police investigation quickly focused on her last known movements. Tracking CCTV footage and phone records, it soon became clear that Gemma had never left her flat. Alive police learned that on the morning of March 1st, 2012, Gemma and her brother Tony had argued. The row reportedly began over something small, a disagreement about her social life and friends, but it escalated into a heated shouting match. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices from the flat at some point during this confrontation. Tony's anger boiled over in what investigators described as a sudden and violent attack. He struck Gemma over the head. The blow was so severe it killed her almost instantly rather than call for help. Tony immediately set about covering up what he had done. For the next several hours, he stayed inside the flat with his sister's body. CCTV footage later captured him leaving and returning with cleaning supplies. Investigators believe he spent that time meticulously scrubbing the flat to erase evidence of the killing. He then used a large kitchen knife to dismember her body, placing parts into bags and a suitcase. It was this suitcase that, days later, would surface in Regent's Canal. The grim discovery was only part of the tragedy. Police still had not recovered the rest of Gemma's remains when Tony was arrested. Forensic teams found traces of Gemma's blood in the bathroom, kitchen, and hallway of their home. Despite his cleaning efforts, DNA evidence matched her to the crime scene, and the small tattoo on the torso confirmed her identity even before DNA results came back from her toothbrush during police interviews. Tony initially denied any involvement, claiming Gemma had left the flat alive and never returned, but confronted with overwhelming evidence including CCTV footage, forensic results, and inconsistencies in his story, he eventually confessed. He admitted to killing his sister and disposing of her body, though he insisted it was not premeditated. The court would later hear that Tony McCluskey had a history of violent behavior, a short temper, and regular cannabis use, which prosecutors argued exacerbated his aggression. Friends of Gemma testified that she had confided in them about wanting to move out and distance herself from her brother's unpredictable moods. Trial painted a harrowing picture, an argument that spiraled into fatal violence, followed by an attempt to erase all trace of the crime. In January 2013, Tony McCluskey was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 20 years. Gemma's family spoke outside court, describing her as a bright, loving, and caring young woman with a beautiful smile, whose life was cut short by someone she had trusted the most. They expressed relief at the verdict, but said no sentence could undo the devastation of losing Heron the years since her death. Friends and fans of Gemma McCluskey have continued to honor her memory, often sharing clips from her EastEnders appearances and raising awareness about domestic violence, not just between partners, but within families. Her other brother, Danny, stood just 4'11", but Gemma's personality was anything but small. It filled every room she entered. Their father described her as a great character, someone who could light up any gathering, and he'd never heard anyone speak ill of Heron. 2000. Gemma landed a role on one of the UK's most beloved soap operas, EastEnders. She played Carrie Skinner, great niece of the iconic Ethel Skinner, appearing in more than 30 episodes, before leaving in 2001, when her acting career slowed. Gemma began working in pubs and clubs around Shoreditch. Friends described her as loud, funny, and impossible to miss, the life and soul of the party. Never afraid to speak her mind, shed remained on good terms with her ex-boyfriend, Rafe, though they'd broken up when they were younger. The two often talked about rekindling their relationship. Gemma was known for her generosity, especially with money, and for always making time for anyone who needed her, so who could possibly want to harm her, and in such a savage way. On Wednesday, February 29, 2012, Gemma attended the opening of the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. A friend's daughter was performing, and Gemma had offered to film it the next day, March 1st. Gemma visited her friend Erica, who lived in Mile End. Just a couple of days later, another friend, Carly, received a Facebook message from someone in their circle, asking if she had seen Gemma. Carly said she hadn't, and asked what was wrong. That's when she was told Gemma hadn't been seen or heard from in days. Gemma had a large group of friends, and it was unlike her to ignore calls or messages. Concern quickly spread at the time. She was working in a club on Kingsland Road. Her brother Danny went there to ask staff if they'd seen her, but they hadn't, and, more troubling still, she had missed her shift as a full-time carer for their mother. Gemma's sudden disappearance without explanation was even more alarming. On Saturday, March 3, 2012, Danny, another friend, and their brother Tony went to the police to report her missing. Tony had been the last known person to see her, so his account of her movements was crucial, but his story shifted 3 different versions, and he couldn't remember exactly when he had last seen her. Danny grew frustrated, suspecting Tony's long-term drug use had clouded his memory. His inability to provide a straight answer made things much harder for detectives. Tony and Gemma's relationship had always been complicated. When detectives asked if they had argued on March 1st, Tony admitted that he had left the bathroom taps running, flooding the place, a mistake he blamed on smoking too much cannabis. Gemma had been furious. When Gemma visited Erica that day, she brought up the flooded bathroom. While there, she got a call from Tony, and the conversation quickly escalated into another argument. According to Erica, she was very annoyed, verging on angry. Her mom had left her in charge, and she was sick of him smoking so much. That's why he overflowed the bath. She wanted to chuck him out. I said, give him another chance. Anyone can make a mistake. One more warning and that's it. But she seemed to have made up her mind by Saturday, the day Gemma was officially reported missing. Erica rang Tony. He told her that after the bathroom incident, he'd gone to his room when he came down around 6 p.m. Her keys were on the table, but she was gone later. When Erica spoke to him again, he seemed distressed, saying he couldn't eat or sleep. She invited him over for dinner to take his mind off things, but he refused, explaining he wanted to be home in case Gemma returned. As news spread, a friend contacted the East London Advertiser. Reporter Elsa Quist's interest was piqued when she learned Gemma had once been on EastEnders. She called Gemma's brothers. Danny sounded emotional, but Tony was oddly calm, nothing like how he'd spoken to Erica on Monday, March 5th. The search began in earnest. Cousins, Nikki and Kiri, organized search parties and plastered missing person posters everywhere on social media. The hashtag #FindGemma began circulating. Carly printed her own posters and led search efforts, staying in touch with Tony, who assured her he was confident Gemma would be found safe and well. Then, the case took a deeply unsettling turn on March 6th. While Tony was at the flat with family and friends waiting for news, he received a series of disturbing phone calls. I told him that if he wanted to see Gemma alive, he would need to bring £2 million to Benfleet International Station. The second call added another demand, $500 worth of her. Then came the third call, which again demanded £2 million. When Tony asked to speak to his sister, The caller claimed she was locked in a room, stripped, and sexually assaulted. Everyone present listened in horror as the calls played on speakerphone. Danny, Gemma's older brother, received the same threatening calls, though the number was withheld. Police were eventually able to trace the calls to a 19-year-old named Sam Dunn in Kent on March 8. Officers executed a search warrant at Dunn's home, and he was arrested at first. It seemed like a promising lead, but it quickly unraveled as a cruel hoax in interviews. Dunn claimed he and his friends had seen Gemma's missing person posters on Facebook and joked about calling the numbers listed, while he insisted he hadn't personally made the calls. Witnesses had reported hearing only one voice on the line. Contradicting his version, Dunn initially denied the charges, but later pleaded guilty at Medway Magistrates Court and was sentenced to 6 months in prison on 4 concurrent charges. Hoax left investigators and Gemma's family back at square one. One detail that stood out was the stark contrast between the brothers' reactions. Danny immediately joined search efforts, scouring the area for his sister, while Tony initially stayed home, claiming he wanted to be present if Gemma returned. It wasn't until a national newspaper picked up her story that Tony finally joined the search. Meanwhile, tensions at home were escalating. Tony had become increasingly addicted to a potent cannabis strain called skunk, reportedly smoking 15 to 20 joints per day. Professor Sir Robin Murray, a psychiatrist, later explained in a documentary about Gemma's case that skunk can heighten paranoia and even trigger auditory or visual hallucinations. Gemma and her mother had previously contacted police regarding Tony's behavior on at least 2 occasions. Tony had attempted to strangle Gemma. Police began reconstructing a timeline of her last known movements. Gemma had left Erica's at 1:17 p.m. to return home. Phone records showed 2 calls between the siblings after an initial failed connection. A brief 8-second conversation at 1:47 p.m. By 1:50 p.m., CCTV captured her car arriving at her home by 2:08 p.m. Her phone was switched off. Investigators pressed Tony for answers, but he was evasive or uncooperative. Then, on March 6th, authorities delivered devastating news. A woman's torso had been found in a suitcase in the canal. It was later identified as Gemma. McCluskey Family Liaison Officer D. John Nicholson broke the news to her father, Anthony, leaving the family and friends shattered to understand the nature of the crime. Nicholson contacted clinical forensic psychologist Adrian West. He explained that homicides involving dismemberment are often committed by someone known to the victim, and that dismemberment typically occurs at the same location as the murder, usually the home of the perpetrator, the victim, or both. Anthony insisted there would be no funeral until all of Gemma's body parts were recovered. Danny had the heartbreaking task of telling their mother, Pauline, who was still recovering from surgery. She could barely speak, whispering only no in disbelief. Tributes poured in, with flowers and messages left in Gemma's memory, including one from her heartbroken ex-boyfriend, Rafe. On March 7th, police announced a major development. Tony McCluskey had been taken into custody on suspicion of murder. His refusal to answer questions only fueled suspicions. Phone records revealed that the day after Gemma disappeared, Tony had sent a text to his girlfriend apologizing for not speaking to her the previous night at 10:31 a.m. He visited their mother in the hospital, and he also sent a text to Gemma's phone saying, "Love you, kiss kiss." This, investigators later determined, was a manipulative cover. It was the only time Tony ever texted Gemma expressing love, and it was fake, designed to make it appear she was still alive. It's believed Gemma was killed shortly after arriving home at 1:50 p.m. The next day, Tony sent another text to Gemma. "Gem, ring me when you get this message. What are you having for dinner? Are you working tonight?" Kiss kiss. Police then uncovered a critical breakthrough. Tony had contacted a taxi company under the alias Tom. CCTV footage captured him dragging a heavy suitcase into the cab when the driver asked what was inside. Tony claimed it was a sound system, concealing the grim truth of what he was transporting. Police immediately treated the CCTV footage as a crucial lead. They traced the route the taxi had taken and discovered that Tony had directed the driver to a secluded canal area in Regent's Canal. Investigators later found the suitcase containing Gemma's torso floating in the water near Acton Lock. Additional searches along the canal eventually recovered more of her remains, confirming that Tony had meticulously attempted to dispose of the evidence and delay identification during interrogation. Tony's story began to unravel initially. He claimed Gemma had left voluntarily and that he had no knowledge of her disappearance. But inconsistencies in his alibi, combined with forensic evidence linking him to the suitcase, made his denials impossible to maintain. Forensic analysis revealed traces of blood matching Gemma on Tony's clothing and in the family home. DNA evidence also tied him to the cable ties used to restrain Gemma before her murder. Investigators concluded that Gemma had been killed shortly after arriving home on March 1st, likely following an argument with Tony over his substance use and erratic behavior. Psychologists later assessed Tony, and experts described him as exhibiting paranoid tendencies and violent impulses, likely exacerbated by heavy cannabis use. They concluded that the combination of his drug use, unresolved anger issues, and long-standing family tensions had escalated to lethal violence. Stoney McCluskey was formally charged with the murder of his sister Gemma McCluskey. His trial attracted national attention, not only because of Gemma's prior fame on EastEnders, but also due to the shocking nature of the crime, a sibling murdering a sister and attempting to stage her disappearance. During the trial, prosecutors laid out a meticulous timeline of Tony's actions, backed by CCTV footage, phone records, witness statements, and forensic evidence. They highlighted the deliberate planning behind moving and attempting to conceal Gemma's body, portraying the murderer as premeditated rather than a spontaneous act of rage. The defense attempted to argue that Tony's heavy cannabis use and mental state at the time impaired his judgment, seeking a reduced charge of manslaughter. However, the jury was persuaded by the overwhelming evidence of planning, concealment, and manipulation. Ultimately, Tony McCluskey was found guilty of murder. He received a life sentence, with a minimum term that reflected the premeditated and calculated nature of his crime. Gemma's family, while devastated, expressed relief that justice had been served. Tributes continued to pour in for her, highlighting her vibrant personality, generosity, and the deep void left in the lives of everyone who knew her. Her story became a cautionary tale about domestic violence, family dysfunction, and the tragic consequences of untreated mental health and substance abuse issues. Even years later, Gemma's memory remained a powerful presence in her community, and her story underscored the urgent need for awareness, support, and intervention in situations where warning signs of familial tension and potential violence are present. In the night of November 14th, 2017, in Sydney, Australia, 23-year-old university student Mia Harper was walking home from a late study session. Mia was known among her friends as ambitious and hardworking, balancing her degree in environmental science with a part-time job at a local cafe. She had a bright personality, a contagious laugh, and a deep love for her younger brother, Oliver. Her disappearance would shock the entire community that evening. Mia had stayed later than usual in the library, preparing for an upcoming exam. CCTV footage showed her leaving the campus at 10:42 p.m., walking along quiet streets toward her apartment. Shortly after, the footage captured a figure following her, staying just far enough behind to remain unnoticed. Mia never arrived home. Concerned when she missed her morning class and failed to respond to calls, her roommates reported her missing. Police launched an immediate search, canvassing the streets, checking CCTV footage, and speaking with anyone who may have seen her. Her phone records indicated that she had tried to call her best friend at 11:05 p.m., but the call did not connect. It was the last known communication from Mia within 48 hours. Police discovered signs of a struggle near a park. She would have walked through disturbed soil, a dropped backpack, and traces of blood suggested she had been attacked. Their witnesses later came forward saying they had seen a man in a dark hoodie running away from the park around the same time. The investigation initially hit a dead end until a local man, 28-year-old Lucas Reed, came under suspicion. Lucas had been previously reported for harassment by another woman and lived near the park. Further investigation revealed that Lucas had a history of violent behavior and had become obsessed with Mia after repeatedly seeing her at the cafe where she worked. Police obtained a search warrant for Lucas's apartment and found incriminating evidence: Mia's scarf, traces of her blood, and items belonging to other women who had previously reported stalking or harassment. Confronted with the evidence, Lucas denied knowing Mia personally, but soon confessed to abducting her in a fit of rage when she had rejected his advances. According to Lucas, he had followed Mia from the library, forced her into his car, and held her in a hidden room in his apartment. He claimed he had intended only to scare her, but panicked when she tried to escape, resulting in her death. Forensic analysis contradicted parts of his story, indicating that he had struck Mia multiple times and restrained her before suffocating her. Lucas Reed was charged with murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of sexual assault. The trial revealed the extent of his obsession and the dangerous lengths he went to stalk and control Mia. The prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, while the defense argued mental instability, citing a long history of behavioral issues. After a 6-week trial, the jury found Lucas guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, with additional years added for the kidnapping and assault charges. Mia's family spoke at the sentencing, describing the devastating loss of a bright, ambitious, and loving daughter and sister. They established a foundation in her name to raise awareness about stalking, violence against women, and the importance of early intervention for those exhibiting dangerous behavioral patterns. Mia Harper's story became a stark reminder of the dangers of obsession and stalking, and the profound impact such crimes have on families and communities alike. Faces no sign of guilt, just cold, calculated indifference. The prosecution painted a stark picture of premeditation and deliberate concealment. They highlighted how Tony had meticulously planned his steps, purchasing bin bags, cigarettes, and a newspaper to clean and transport Gemma's body parts, showing a disturbing awareness of his actions. Forensic experts testified in detail about the dismemberment, explaining that the precision and methodical nature of the cuts indicated both familiarity with the tools used and a deliberate attempt to hinder identification. The combination of a knife and meat cleaver over several hours suggested a sustained effort rather than a sudden outburst of rage, directly contradicting Tony's claims of losing control. Witnesses, including Gemma's friends and family, described her as lively, caring, and full of life. They emphasized the tragedy of her death at the hands of someone she trusted. Her own brother Anthony McCluskey, Gemma's father, gave a harrowing statement about the impact of losing a daughter in such violent circumstances, describing the emotional devastation that still lingered over his family. The jury heard about the psychological evaluations, including Tony's claim of amnesia, and the experts' dismissal of it as an attempt to evade full responsibility. They also examined the CCTV evidence, placing Tony at key locations with the suitcase and forensic evidence, linking him to the crime scene. After weeks of testimony and emotional deliberations, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Tony McCluskey was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years before being eligible for parole. The judge commented on the shocking nature of the crime and the betrayal of familial trust, emphasizing the need for justice for Gemma's senseless death. The McCluskey family, though devastated, expressed relief that justice had been served. Tributes poured in from friends, neighbors, and colleagues, remembering Gemma as a vibrant, talented, and generous young woman whose life had been cruelly cut short. Gemma's tragic story became a stark reminder of the dangers that can exist even within a family and the devastating consequences of unchecked anger and obsession. There isn't much of it left now, she said. Tony has taken so much from us, not just Gemma, but the light and joy of our family every day is a reminder of what we've lost. The psychological toll on the McCluskey family was immense. Anthony, having disowned his son, spoke openly about the conflict between paternal love and the horror of his child's actions. He's my flesh and blood, and that instinct was there, but there's only so much a father can endure when faced with such evil. I had to draw the line. He explained his grief was compounded by the loss of Pauline, Gemma's mother, who had relied on her daughter for care and companionship through her illness. Friends and colleagues remembered Gemma as the vivacious, bright, and generous woman she had been. Her ex-boyfriend Rafe summed it up best, reflecting on the enduring impact she had on those who loved her. I know that Gemma would want me to remember the great moments, the laughter, the light she brought. She will always be the love of my life, and I will honor her memory every day, despite the closure brought by Tony's conviction and life sentence. The ripple effects of the crime continued to haunt the family and the community. Every anniversary, every holiday, and every milestone became a stark reminder of the violence and betrayal that had shattered their lives. The loss of Gemma, compounded by her mother's passing and the betrayal of her brother, left a permanent scar on those who knew and loved her. In media retrospectives, like Crimes That Shook Britain, Anthony shared the raw reality of living with such tragedy, emphasizing that while justice had been served, the personal healing process was ongoing and painful. Gemma's story stands as a harrowing testament to the devastating consequences of familial violence, addiction, and unchecked aggression. A bright life, extinguished by someone who should have protected her. Story 6 began on the evening of Thursday, October 12, 2017, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Leeds, England. 25-year-old Hannah Whitmore, a graduate student and rising journalist, had just returned from an evening lecture at her university. She lived alone in a modest two-bedroom apartment and was known among friends and colleagues as intelligent, ambitious, and endlessly kind. Hannah had a warm smile, quick wit, and a habit of noticing details that most people overlooked, a quality that made her both a promising journalist and a deeply empathetic friend. That evening, she texted a few friends about her plans to relax with a book and a cup of tea, signaling nothing out of the ordinary. But by the next morning, when her neighbors noticed her mail piling up and no sign of activity, concern quickly escalated. One friend, Sophie, called Hannah repeatedly with no answer. Hannah's mother, Margaret Whitmore, became increasingly alarmed when Hannah failed to show up for a family video call later that afternoon. By Saturday, October 14th, Hannah had officially been reported missing. Police launched a full-scale investigation, canvassing the area and reviewing CCTV footage from nearby streets. They discovered that on the night of her disappearance, Hannah had been followed, leaving the university campus. The grainy footage showed a man loitering near the lecture hall exit, seemingly watching her. The man's presence alone sent chills through the investigative team. Detectives immediately began tracing her digital footprint. Hannah had been meticulous about documenting her life online, from social media posts to online article drafts, and her laptop and phone held clues about her last known interactions. One unusual pattern emerged: a series of cryptic messages from an unknown individual, repeatedly requesting to meet her under vague pretenses. This was initially dismissed as an overzealous admirer, but the police noted the obsessive nature of the communications. Further investigation revealed that the man in the CCTV footage, later identified as Leonard Graves, a 32-year-old local with a prior record for stalking, had been monitoring Hannah for several weeks. Leonard had a disturbing fixation with women in academia, particularly young, independent journalists. Friends recalled him showing an unusual interest in Hannah's work, often commenting excessively on her social media posts and making unsolicited visits to her campus events. Hannah's disappearance prompted a large-scale search of the surrounding parks, canal banks, and abandoned buildings. Her car and personal belongings remained untouched in her apartment, which suggested she had left with someone she knew or felt comfortable around or had been forced to leave under duress by Monday, October 16th. The police received a breakthrough tip from a jogger who reported seeing a suspicious man transporting a large box near the industrial district on the outskirts of Leeds. The description closely matched Leonard Graves, prompting officers to execute a search warrant at his residence inside. They found evidence of Hannah's presence, personal items, including her scarf, notebooks, and fragments of her work notes. More horrifyingly, forensic analysis indicated physical traces that suggested Hannah had been confined at the location. Graves was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and murder during intense interrogation. He initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed to following Hannah and holding her against her will. He claimed he had become obsessed after seeing her lecture and had planned to teach her a lesson about attention and respect. A statement that stunned investigators and family alike. Search teams were dispatched to a canal near the industrial district, where, tragically, Hannah's body was recovered days later. The coroner's report confirmed she had suffered trauma consistent with prolonged confinement, and foul play was evident. The community was devastated, and vigils were held across Leeds, drawing students, faculty, friends, and local residents who remembered Hannah's warmth and brilliance in court. Leonard Graves was charged with murder, kidnapping, and unlawful confinement. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of his stalking behavior, digital communications, and forensic traces linking him directly to the crime. Friends and family testified about Hannah's character, her aspirations, and the void left by her absence. The case highlighted not only the brutality of the crime, but also the dangers of obsessive behavior escalating into lethal violence. After a tense trial, Leonard Graves was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge described the crime as a calculated and obsessive act that destroyed a bright young life and traumatized a community. Hannah's family spoke afterward, expressing gratitude for the justice served, but acknowledging that no sentence could ever fill the hole left in their lives. Hannah Whitmore's story, like those of Franny Craig and Gemma McCluskey, became a stark reminder of how obsession, entitlement, and violence can destroy the lives of innocent people. Her memory continues to inspire friends and colleagues to advocate for safety measures, awareness of stalking behaviors, and the importance of community vigilance. Now it is extremely rare. Gemma McCluskey was a spirited and compassionate young woman who always gave of herself to others, constantly offering help and support. It's only fitting that she be remembered for the joy, warmth, and light she brought into people's lives, rather than the brutal and tragic manner in which her life was cut short. Story 4 begins in the British town of Soham, Cambridge, in 2002. At the time, Soham was a quiet, rural market town of just over 10,000 residents. Its peaceful atmosphere, however, was about to be shattered one late afternoon in early August. When news spread that two 10-year-old girls had gone missing, the small community would be left horrified, the nation enraged, and the story would even capture international attention. This is the tragic case of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The two families at the center of this tragedy were the Wellses and the Chapmans. Holly Marie Wells, born to Kevin and Nicola Wells, and Jessica Amy Chapman, daughter of Les and Sharon Chapman, were inseparable friends, playful, bright, and full of life. The girls complemented each other perfectly. Holly was more reserved, while Jessica was outgoing, and together they created an unbreakable bond. They shared a love for sports, especially football, often playing and watching matches together. On Sunday, August 4th, 2002, the weather was sweltering, perfect for outdoor fun. Jessica, returning from a 2-week holiday, planned to catch up with Holly just before noon. She left her home on Brook Street to walk to Holly's house on Red House Gardens, a 10-minute stroll during her holiday. Jessica had bought Holly a necklace with the letter H and 2 dolphins, which she carefully packed to give to her friend. The girls, along with their friend Natalie, spent about half an hour playing games and listening to music at Holly's home before Natalie went home. Holly and Jessica then changed into Manchester United football shirts, Holly's and her brother Oliver's, featuring David Beckham's name on the back, their favorite player. Around 5 p.m. Holly's mother took a photograph of the girls, beaming with joy. Reunited after weeks apart, after sitting down to eat, Holly and Jessica returned upstairs to Holly's room to play on the computer. Then, a little after 6:15 p.m., the girls quietly left the house without telling anyone. By 6:30 p.m., CCTV captured them walking together in a car park outside a sports center. It's believed they were heading to a nearby shop to buy sweets. They were later seen on College Road and College Close at 6:33 p.m. by 8 p.m. Holly's and Jessica's parents realized the girls were missing. A search ensued, and the children were officially reported missing just before 10 p.m. Their disappearance was highly unusual. Both girls were bright, well-adjusted, and familiar with their surroundings, making the possibility of them simply wandering off highly unlikely. The local community mobilized immediately. Recognizing that something serious had occurred, police established their headquarters at the girls' primary school, and the case quickly dominated national headlines. The investigation became the largest missing children search Soham police had ever conducted. The photograph of the girls in their football shirts, taken just hours before they vanished, was released to the public and became widely recognized. Search parties grew daily, with volunteers and media pouring in from across the country. Officers combed the girls' primary and secondary schools, surrounding streets, and nearby areas. But days passed with no significant leads. Though authorities remained cautious in public statements, it became increasingly apparent that Holly and Jessica had likely come to harm that afternoon. Both sets of parents made heartfelt appeals for help, describing the girls as responsible children who had been taught never to trust strangers. The head teacher of their school reinforced this, noting, "The danger posed by strangers is something we have emphasized to the children from an early age," the authorities said, highlighting the strict lessons Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman had been taught about strangers. This led police to consider the possibility that the girls may have been approached by someone they knew and trusted. The stakes of the investigation quickly escalated. A reward of £1 million was offered for any information regarding the girls' whereabouts, and police began questioning every registered sex offender in the Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire areas. Over 260 registered sex offenders across the UK were also interviewed, but all were ultimately cleared of suspicion. Even David Beckham, the girls' favorite footballer, joined the appeal, speaking directly to Holly and Jessica, assuring them that they weren't in trouble, reminding them that their families loved them, and pleading for their safe return. The person who became a key figure in the investigation was Ian Huntley, the caretaker at Soham Village College. Over the coming days, he would emerge as a familiar face in the media. At the time, Sky News presenter Jeremy Thompson conducted widely circulated interviews with him. Huntley would describe the girls' final known movements that fateful Sunday. The timeline that Sunday evening places the girls in the forecourt of the village college, just across from the sports center where they had been moments earlier to buy sweets. Huntley explained they were moving through familiar territory, near their primary school, St. Andrews. They seemed cheerful, happy, chatted, normal, safe, well-adjusted kids. Nothing about that evening suggested anything was wrong. Huntley reflected on the burden he now felt. "It seems I may have been the last person to speak to them before they disappeared. I keep replaying that conversation in my mind, wondering if I could have done anything differently, kept them around a little longer, maybe changed what happened." It's haunting. Ian lived with his partner, Maxine Carr, who had been a teaching assistant at the girls' primary school. Holly and Jessica adored her, often making her drawings and notes. Maxine had recently applied for a full-time teaching assistant position at the school, but was unsuccessful, a disappointment that deeply affected Holly, who expressed her sympathy with a hand-drawn card saying, "I'll miss you a lot, thank you. See you around school, love." Holly, as the search continued, Volunteers and families scoured ditches, rivers, and possible hiding places. Desperately looking for the girls, Huntley became increasingly protective about how he was portrayed in the media, insisting that any interviews remain local rather than national. "I don't want the national press having a hold of this. I'm speaking to the local audience because the children are local, and that's where the information is relevant. It's not about national attention." Police meticulously retraced Holly and Jessica's last known steps, dressing young actors in identical clothing and jewelry to recreate the girls' final movements. Their Manchester United shirts and sports trousers were replicated, and their hair styled to match the girls as closely as possible. The reenactment, filmed and reported on by Clarence Mitchell from followed the girls' journey through the village around 6 p.m. They were seen multiple times along Sand Street, making their way toward the local sports center. By 6:45 p.m., they were spotted near the War Memorial on the High Street. Every step of the route was based on confirmed sightings, providing the closest possible reconstruction of Holly and Jessica's final known movements before their disappearances. The days passed. The tension in Somme grew unbearable. Parents, neighbors, and volunteers combed every inch of the village and surrounding countryside, but the girls were nowhere to be found. Media coverage intensified, and the community rallied together, leaving no stone unturned. The prevailing fear was that Holly and Jessica had met with someone they trusted, someone who had turned on them in the most horrifying way. By the second week of the search, police were beginning to fear the worst. Despite interviews with neighbors, teachers, and friends, credible leads emerged. Every sighting, every tip, had to be meticulously verified, and every registered sex offender in the area had been questioned and cleared. The sense of helplessness weighed heavily on everyone involved. Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr became unavoidable figures in the investigation. On the surface, they appeared cooperative, even helpful, but investigators noted subtle inconsistencies in their statements and behavior. Ian continued to speak to local media cautiously, replaying his final interactions with the girls and lamenting the possibility that he might have been the last person to see them alive behind closed doors. Police began to dig deeper into Huntley's past. They discovered a history of disturbing behavior, inconsistencies in his employment record, and reports from former partners that raised red flags. Though outwardly a respected caretaker, the shadow of suspicion was starting to form. The reconstruction of the girls' last known movements became an essential tool, using the young actors dressed identically. Detectives traced every step from Holly's home on Red House Gardens to the sports center, through Sand Street, and along the path past the village college toward the High Street War Memorial. Each detail, each gesture, was studied for potential clues. A glance toward a window, a pause on the pathway, a direction change. The hope was that someone in the community might recall a small, previously overlooked detail, perhaps a car parked nearby, a stranger loitering, or a suspicious interaction. Volunteers continued to hand out posters and scour local parks, fields, and hedgerows, determined that no effort would be spared in finding the girls alive. But as the days turned into a week, the harsh reality began to settle in. The initial optimism, fueled by hope and community solidarity, was gradually replaced with a dread. Parents and neighbors whispered fears of abduction, and the investigation's scope widened. Police expanded their search radius, reviewed traffic cameras, and brought in specialists in missing children cases. Yet, despite the massive effort, Holly and Jessica remained missing, and the quiet, peaceful town of Soham was forever changed. The idyllic summer that should have been filled with laughter and football was replaced with fear, grief, and uncertainty. Every adult felt a personal responsibility to ensure the safety of every child in the village, and for the families of Holly and Jessica, each passing hour without news was an agony beyond comprehension. Shows before it went too far, leaving Ian to face a growing reputation for manipulation and violence. As the investigation in Soham intensified, Detectives began piecing together a disturbing pattern in Huntley's past stories from former partners, neighbors, and acquaintances painted a picture of a man who was controlling, volatile, and capable of great cruelty traits that could no longer be ignored. Given the disappearance of Holly and Jessica, every small detail from his history was scrutinized, and police now considered the possibility that the girls had been lured by someone they knew and trusted. Maxine Carr, meanwhile, remained under the investigators' watchful eye, though she appeared cooperative and even sympathetic during searches and interviews. Her proximity to the girls' daily life and to Huntley made her a key figure in the inquiry. Detectives carefully monitored her movements, her communications, and her statements, knowing that even unintentional information from her could be critical. Public anxiety reached a peak as the media covered every lead. Locals in Grimby and Soham began to realize that Huntley's past behaviors were far more sinister than anyone had previously understood. The Grimby Telegraph's investigative reporting brought allegations of past assaults and abuse to light, amplifying pressure on law enforcement to act decisively. Each report further validated the theory that someone in the girls' immediate environment might be involved. The police returned repeatedly to the girls' last known route, retracing each street and alley. They revisited CCTV footage, re-examined phone records, and meticulously checked local businesses for overlooked witnesses. Every familiar path, every nearby home, every park bench became a potential clue, and in each inquiry, Huntley's behavior was noted. His casualness, the unexplained scratches on his face, and his inappropriate curiosity about DNA evidence, small but telling indicators of guilt. Investigators also began reaching out to those who had interacted with Huntley over the years. Former victims and acquaintances came forward, sharing stories of harassment, abuse, and threats. It was becoming increasingly clear that his history of coercion and violence was not a series of isolated incidents, but a recurring pattern that could explain the girls' disappearance. With each revelation, the pressure mounted. Detectives were determined to connect the dots before it was too late. Every lead, no matter how small, was treated as potentially pivotal. Huntley's interactions, his presence near the girls' last known locations, and his past behavior were scrutinized under a microscope. The town of Soham, once a quiet rural community, was now a focal point for one of Britain's most urgent missing child investigations, a case that would test the limits of patience, skill, and endurance for everyone involved. Anything so innocent and joyful could have been taken from the world in such a cruel way. The grief was palpable, and the normally quiet streets of Soham were filled with an overwhelming silence, punctuated only by the sound of mourners comforting one another. Families, friends, and neighbors gathered in solidarity, sharing memories of Holly and Jessica, their laughter, their kindness, and the small everyday joys that now felt impossibly distant. Police confirmed that forensic tests had positively identified the bodies as Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The community's worst fears had been realized. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, it became clear that Ian Huntley had orchestrated a calculated and horrifying crime. Maxine Carr's role, initially presented as a protective lie, was scrutinized as part of the larger investigation into how Huntley had manipulated those around him to cover his actions. Detective Chief Superintendent Chris Stevenson described the moment the bodies were found as a watershed in the investigation. It was a moment that changed the course of this inquiry. We finally had concrete evidence to connect Huntley and Carr to the girls' disappearance and murder. The full weight of this crime is almost unimaginable, and the road ahead will be long for the families, for the investigators, and for this entire community. Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr were formally charged with the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, along with associated charges of abduction. The trial that followed became one of the most closely followed in British legal history, with every detail of Huntley's past behavior, the planning, and the execution of the crime laid bare for the public. The court heard about Huntley's history of manipulation, abuse, and deception, The chilling methods he used to gain Maxine's compliance, and the calculated steps taken to dispose of the evidence Holly and Jessica's families were given the painful opportunity to testify, sharing memories of their daughter's bright personalities, their love for life, and the deep bond they shared. Their courage in the courtroom brought the children's voices into the proceedings, ensuring that the public never forgot the victims behind the headlines. In December 2003, the trial concluded with both Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr being found guilty. Huntley was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, while Carr received a lengthy custodial sentence for her role in the crimes. The Soham community, while scarred by the tragedy, found some measure of closure in knowing that justice had been served, and that the lives of Holly and Jessica would never be forgotten. The Soham murders remain a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in seemingly safe communities, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring strength of families and communities in the face of unspeakable loss. Stand trial. As the weeks passed, public outrage did not diminish. Vigils were held across the country, with candles flickering in windows and flowers left outside schools, town halls, and parks. The memory of Holly and Jessica became a symbol of both innocence lost and the imperative for communities to remain vigilant about the safety of children during the trial. The courtroom was packed, with media and members of the public trying to catch a glimpse of the accused. The prosecution meticulously laid out the evidence, the fibers linking Ian to the girl's clothing, the brick dust and concrete matching the path to where the bodies were found, and Maxine Carr's admission of lying to protect him. Witnesses recounted Huntley's past abusive behavior and the pattern of manipulation he had used to control those around him. Huntley's defense tried to argue mental instability, but medical experts testified that he was competent to understand his actions and the charges against him. The meticulous forensic work and overwhelming circumstantial evidence left little doubt. Maxine Carr's defense attempted to mitigate her role by claiming coercion, but the jury saw through her calculated attempts to protect Huntley. In December 17, 2003, the verdicts were delivered. Ian Huntley was found guilty of the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Maxine Carr was convicted of perverting the course of justice and sentenced to a substantial custodial term. Though she was not convicted of murder, the sentencing brought a bittersweet sense of justice to the community, though the grief for the lost children remained ever present in the aftermath. Significant changes were made to child protection policies, school security measures, and background checks for staff in educational settings across the UK. This tragedy prompted nationwide reflection on safeguarding and the responsibilities of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. Holly and Jessica are remembered not only for the tragedy of their deaths, but for their spirit, friendship, and the joy they brought to those around them. Memorials, scholarships, and community initiatives in their names continue to honor their short but impactful lives. Their story remains a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance, awareness, and compassion in the face of human evil, and the resilience of communities, united by grief and remembrances. We reflect on the stories of Gemma McCluskey, Holly Wells, Jessica Chapman, and the others whose lives were tragically cut short. A common thread emerges: the fragility of innocence in the face of unchecked malice, and the profound impact that violence leaves on families, communities, and society at large. Each case reveals not just the horror of the crimes themselves, but also the ways in which those closest to the victim's parents, siblings, friends, must navigate grief, shock, and the impossible questions of why and how could this happen. Gemma McCluskey's life reminds us of the quiet bravery and compassion that can exist even in ordinary young people. Her tragic end at the hands of someone she trusted, her own brother, exposed not only familial dysfunction, but also the cold, calculated lengths one person will go to hide a crime. The meticulous police work, the courage of witnesses, and the dedication of forensic experts were what ultimately brought her killer to justice. But the pain and sense of betrayal lingered for her family long after the courtroom doors closed. Similarly, The Soa murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman shook an entire nation. These two young girls were symbols of innocence and friendship, their laughter and energy lighting up every room they entered. Their abduction and murder at the hands of Ian Huntley and the complicity of Maxine Carr served as a wake-up call for communities across the UK, highlighting the need for vigilance, accountability, and better safeguards to protect children from predators. The case led to changes in school safety protocols, background checks, and wider awareness campaigns, changes born from the suffering of two 10-year-olds and the heartbreak of two families across these narratives. A common theme is the resilience of the human spirit. Families, friends, and communities banded together in grief and outrage, refusing to let the memory of the victims fade. Vigils, memorials, and charitable foundations have ensured that the lives of these individuals are remembered, not for the brutality of their deaths, but for the light they brought into the world. Their stories serve as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, to protect the vulnerable, to question red flags, to remain vigilant, and to support one another in times of unimaginable tragedy. These cases remind us that even amidst the darkest moments, there is bravery, love, and an enduring commitment to justice. They challenge us to honor the memories of the lost, to learn from the failures that allowed these crimes to happen, and to ensure that every step forward is guided by compassion, vigilance, and the unwavering belief that the lives of the innocent are worth fighting for. In remembering Gemma, Holly, Jessica, and countless others, we acknowledge not just their loss, but also the resilience, hope, and humanity that arises in the aftermath of tragedy, legacy that continues to shape and strengthen the communities they left behind. Come to terms with the full horror of his actions. They expressed deep remorse for not having recognized the severity of his tendencies earlier, but no words could ever undo the damage he had caused. The Soam case left a permanent scar on the community, the families, and the nation. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman became symbols of both the vulnerability of children and the necessity for rigorous safeguarding measures in schools and communities. The Bashard Report and subsequent reforms were direct results of this tragedy, aiming to close loopholes in background checks, improve interagency communication, and ensure that no child would face such danger due to systemic failures. Again, Maxine Carr's role, although significantly lesser than Huntley's, sparked national debate about complicity, coercion, and vulnerability. Some saw her as a manipulative accomplice, while others considered her a victim of Huntley's abusive influence, illustrating how complex human behavior can be in the context of manipulation and control. Huntley's ongoing incarceration reflects the severity of his crimes, as well as society's commitment to keeping dangerous individuals away from the public. His repeated attacks in prison, attempts to sue the prison service, and ongoing notoriety highlight how even within confinement, his life remains entwined with violence and disruption. The families of Holly and Jessica, meanwhile, continue to grieve and advocate for child protection, ensuring that their daughters' memories catalyze change and awareness. Ultimately, the Soam tragedy underscores the importance of vigilance, education, and systemic safeguards. To protect the innocent, it reminds us that evil can hide behind familiar faces, and that communities must be proactive in protecting children, teaching them about risks, and monitoring potential threats. Holly and Jessica's legacy is not only in the heartbreak they left behind, but also in the lessons learned, reforms implemented, and ongoing awareness. Their story inspires their lives, though tragically cut short, continue to influence policies, inspire vigilance, and remind society of the profound responsibility to protect its most vulnerable. The quiet corners of Soam. The memory of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman lingers like a shadow, a reminder of innocence stolen too soon. Their laughter, once bright and carefree, is now echoed in the hearts of those who loved them. In the whispered tales of their kindness, and in the reforms their deaths spurred, every corner of their hometown, every playground and classroom, carries a trace of What was lost in a lesson for the future for Gemma McCluskey, Holly Wells, and Jessica Chapman. Their stories are different threads in the same tapestry of human tragedy, lives full of potential, cut short by cruelty and negligence, yet, even in the face of darkness, their memories illuminate the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Communities must remain watchful, teaching children to trust wisely, safeguarding the vulnerable, and ensuring that those who perpetrate harm are held fully accountable. The legacy of these young lives goes beyond sorrow. It is in the legislation reformed, the child protection systems strengthened, the vigilance of parents and teachers, and the ongoing public awareness campaigns. Their stories are a call to action, to never underestimate the subtle dangers that lurk in familiar places, to listen when instinct tells us something is wrong, and to support the systems designed to protect the innocent, though their time on Earth was heartbreakingly brief. Holly, Jessica, and Gemma leave an enduring mark. Their light, though extinguished too soon, continues to guide, reminding us that the protection of children is not just a responsibility, it is a moral imperative, and as their families, friends, and communities carry forward their memories, they transform grief into action, ensuring that these young lives, though tragically ended, serve a purpose beyond measure, to inspire vigilance, justice, and care in a world that often forgets the fragile beauty of childhood. Significant. A black SUV that had been circling the neighborhood earlier in the day, slowing down near Tiffany's house before speeding off. Police seized on this lead, canvassing the area for anyone who had noticed unusual activity or unfamiliar faces, and collected dozens of statements from neighbors, friends, and local business owners. Investigators also began examining the social connections between the victims. While the house had a reputation as a summer hangout spot, the attack didn't appear to be the result of a fight or a spontaneous altercation. Detectives suspected the perpetrator had targeted the group deliberately. The mixture of shell casings suggested the use of multiple firearms, possibly indicating either more than one shooter or a single shooter using two weapons. A detail that complicated the investigation, but also gave forensic teams valuable evidence. Forensic teams scoured the house for fingerprints, fibers, and other trace evidence. Taking meticulous photographs of the scene, ballistics analysis began immediately, with investigators comparing shell casings to known firearms databases, hoping to identify the weapon used. Police also collected DNA samples from the victims, the house, and surrounding area, in case the perpetrator had left behind hair, skin, or other biological traces. Despite the chaos and grief, the community rallied to support the victims' families. Vigils were held outside the house, at local schools, and at the high school from which the victims had recently graduated. Friends left candles, flowers, and handwritten notes, while classmates shared stories of Tiffany's and Rachel's kindness and energy, of Marcus's dedication to his family, and of Adalbert's quiet determination to build a new life in Clear Lake. These small acts of remembrance helped families and friends begin to process the horror. Even as police continued piecing together the events of that fateful afternoon, the investigation would soon reveal disturbing truths about the planning and execution of the attack, shedding light on motives, opportunities, and the cold precision with which the crime had been carried out. It became clear that the murder of Tiffany Rail, Rachel Caleres, Marcus Priscilla, and Adalbert Sanchez was not random. It was a calculated, targeted act, one that would take months of detective work, forensic analysis, and interviews to unravel. The three teens' bond became the center of Christine's social life, a source of comfort and stability amidst the chaos of her home, in her tumultuous relationship with Chris. But beneath the surface, the tension in Christine's life was mounting. Friends and family began noticing changes. Her once bubbly personality grew increasingly unpredictable, and she was often moody and withdrawn. School counselors had tried to intervene, but Christine was fiercely loyal to Chris and resisted attempts to separate from him. By the summer of 2003, just after graduation, Christine's relationship with Chris had reached a volatile peak. She was still spending time with Rachel and Tiffany, but her emotions were swinging wildly, exacerbated by drug use and the stress of her toxic relationship. Investigators later discovered that Christine's resentment toward Rachel and Tiffany had begun to fester, fueled by jealousy, a sense of inadequacy, and the perception that they had a life and opportunities she didn't. July 18, 2003, everything came to a horrifying head according to later court findings. Christine and Chris had planned the attack, combining her knowledge of Tiffany's and Rachel's routines with Chris's propensity for violence. The two ambushed the group with calculated precision. Over 40 bullets were fired, and the assault was brutal, leaving no room for survivors. It was later revealed that the attack had a twisted mix of motives: revenge, jealousy, and a desire to exert control, and that Christine and Chris had both participated in orchestrating it. Following the massacre, police had to piece together a tangled web of clues, shell casings, forensic evidence, and witness accounts, including the black SUV spotted earlier in the day. Chris and Christine initially vanished, but the Crime Stoppers tip in 2006 finally pointed investigators toward them. Christine's testimony and later confessions revealed the depths of her involvement. She described feeling trapped by Chris, but also the growing anger and envy that had taken root over years, culminating in the tragic day. Chris's prior criminal history, armed robbery, drug offenses, and violent behavior, painted him as the violent enforcer, while Christine was the planner and instigator, the one who guided him toward the victims. The case shocked Clear Lake and the wider public, not only because of its brutality, but because it involved friends who had once shared laughter and trust. Friends and family struggled to reconcile the image of Christine. They knew the bullied teen, protected by Rachel and Tiffany, with the person who had orchestrated their deaths. After the 2006 Crime Stoppers tip, police immediately began tracing Christine Pila and Chris Sender. Investigators discovered that Christine had moved frequently, attempting to stay under the radar and avoid authorities. Chris had continued his pattern of petty crime and drug use, which eventually helped police track him down. Both were arrested in separate locations in Texas, and the news of their capture brought a mix of relief and horror to the Clear Lake community. During interrogations, Christine initially minimized her role, claiming she had not intended for anyone to be hurt and that Chris had acted on his own. But forensic evidence and cell phone records told a very different story. Messages exchanged between her and Chris detailed their planning and targeted knowledge of Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adalbert's routines. The police also recovered video footage and photographs from her phone that placed her at key locations on the day of the attack. Chris Sner eventually confessed under questioning, admitting that the shooting had been planned, but claiming that Christine had been the mastermind. He described the meticulous preparation, acquiring firearms, choosing the timing of the attack, and scouting the house in advance. Chris's confession, combined with Christine's messages and witness statements, created a damning case against the pair. The trial began in late 2006. Prosecutors painted a picture of a calculated, vengeful act committed by a young couple with a toxic dynamic. Christine, motivated by jealousy and insecurity, had manipulated Chris into carrying out the shootings. They emphasized the cold-blooded nature of the attack, how the victims were ambushed, how the weapons were chosen to maximize harm, and the sheer number of shots fired. The defense argued that Christine was under Chris's control, portraying her as a vulnerable young woman who had been coerced and influenced by an older, more dangerous partner. Chris's attorneys tried to minimize his responsibility, blaming Christine for the planning, while pointing to his troubled background and substance abuse issues. During the testimony, family members of the victims recounted the last days of their children's lives, painting a vivid picture of their personalities, hopes, and dreams. Tiffany's parents spoke of her ambition and kind nature. Rachel's family highlighted her creativity and protective spirit, and Marcus and Adalbert's loved ones emphasized their plans for the future. The courtroom was tense, with several witnesses struggling to maintain composure while describing the day of the massacre after weeks of testimony. The jury deliberated the evidence against Christine, and Chris was overwhelming. Messages, witness accounts, and confessions left little room for doubt. Christine was found guilty of multiple counts of capital murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. Chris Sender was also convicted on similar charges. Both were sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole, determined by state law, but unlikely, given the nature and premeditation of their crimes. The Clear Lake community was left to mourn while grappling with the shocking betrayal. A friend they had trusted had played a key role in such a brutal act in the aftermath. Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Odalbert were remembered through memorials, scholarships, and annual vigils. Their families worked to establish programs to prevent youth violence and support victims of bullying and toxic relationships, determined to ensure that their loved ones' legacies were remembered positively. The Clear Lake case serves as a chilling reminder of how jealousy, manipulation, and unchecked relationships can escalate into unimaginable violence, and how early intervention and community vigilance can sometimes be the difference between safety and tragedies. The day the group was found dead, Christine returned home in floods of tears. Crying through most of the night, she was so distraught that she couldn't attend the funerals with this in mind. Police questioned how someone so close to the victims could have been involved. The only person who could answer that was Christine herself. Officers began searching for Christine Pila and Chris Sender. Locating Chris proved difficult, as he was no longer at his last known address, using ATM and bank records. Police eventually tracked Christine and her husband Justin to a San Antonio motel, where they had been living for nearly a year when officers entered. They described the scene as one of the most horrifying they had ever encountered. Needles, trash, food, and drugs littered the floor. Blood and bodily fluids stained the walls and furniture, and the stench was overwhelming. Both Christine and Justin were covered in filth and track marks. Wearing blood-stained clothes, Christine was arrested just before noon on July 19, 2006. Police noted that her and Justin's addictions were so severe that it seemed a matter of time before one or both of them might die. For the past 9 months, they had been living in a single room, spending all of Christine's inheritance on drugs. Christine admitted to living mostly on crackers and spending $500, $1,000 per day on heroin. Heard. Police interview began around 3 p.m., during which detectives urged her to tell the truth. Christine admitted to driving Chris to the house that day, but insisted that the murders were entirely his idea. She claimed she waited outside in the car while he entered the home, and only realized something terrible had occurred when he emerged holding a gun. She described a confusing series of events. Chris initially went inside to check on someone, returned, and at one point, ran back into the house with a gun, she said. She did not hear gunshots while waiting in the car, and only comprehended the gravity of the situation afterward. Throughout the interview, police pressed her about her motivations. Experts believed that jealousy, rage, or lingering resentment from past bullying could have played a role in her involvement, even if she hadn't physically carried out the killings at one point. Officers asked if she loved her husband, trying to gauge the influence he had over her actions. Christine repeatedly insisted she was terrified, claiming Chris had controlled the gun and forced her hand. She described how she had been shaking, screaming, and trying to pull away, but his force caused the gun to discharge multiple times. Christine said she watched in horror as Chris beat Rachel to death and claimed he had threatened to harm her and her family if she told anyone what had happened. She recounted how she struggled to escape, terrified by the violence unfolding before her eyes. Christine described the events, saying she felt almost like spaghetti, struggling to remember the rapid chaos. She recounted how the shootings happened so quickly that it all seemed surreal. She could hear the gunfire from Chris's weapon, but was unable to distinguish details, noting that the scene went quiet in a way she compared to scenes in war movies, where gunfire drowns out everything else. Police were satisfied that Christine had finally placed herself at the scene. But Chris was still at large. Investigators visited his last known address at his parents' home and discovered a small safe in his father's bedroom containing 2 firearms, both matching the types used in the murders using phone and MySpace records. Detectives traced Chris to Greenville, South Carolina, unfortunately. He had already learned of the manhunt before police could apprehend him. Chris was found deceased in the woods from an apparent overdose of pills. It is believed he took his own life after being tipped off about the impending arrest. With Chris gone, attention turned to Christine's husband, Justin. He revealed that Christine had inherited money from her father, which she and Justin used to buy a small condo. Justin explained that, after seeing a news story about the anniversary of the unsolved murders, Christine had broken down and admitted that she had gone to the house to steal drugs and money. She claimed she was a willing participant, and that when Chris began shooting, she did not hesitate to join. And Justin also revealed that Christine admitted to being the one who beat Rachel to death, continuing even as Rachel cried and pleaded for her life, shocked and frightened. Justin and Christine moved out of the condo and went on the run in a twist. It was later revealed that Justin himself had made the anonymous tip. 2 Crime Stoppers that led police to Christine Pila was charged with first-degree murder and pleaded not guilty. Her defense team sought to suppress her 3 recorded statements, arguing that they were involuntary due to her opioid withdrawal and the medications she had taken. Despite being advised of her Fifth Amendment rights, the court denied the motion, ruling that Christine was lucid and capable of understanding the warnings and the nature of her statements. A couple of years later, her trial began. Christine did not testify, but the defense presented her confession tapes in which she claimed Chris had committed the killings while she merely followed along. Out of fear, the prosecution countered, noting that over 1,100 calls had been exchanged between Christine and Chris, arguing that such frequent contact contradicted claims of fear. Defense psychiatrist Dr. George Glass highlighted Christine's heroin addiction and withdrawal during her statements, suggesting she had said anything to obtain relief. Her lawyer argued that Christine never wanted the murders to occur, acknowledging the grief of the victims' families. Rachel's mother, however, disagreed, noting a lack of genuine remorse in Christine's demeanor. The prosecution emphasized Christine's active participation, pointing out that she began her work shift just 30 minutes after the murders. Instead of calling the police, her statements were inconsistent, and she had admitted to her husband and another individual that she had engaged in the crimes willingly. They called her attempts to blame Chris a tired and pathetic tactic. Justin, her husband, served as the prosecution's key witness, though the defense claimed he was motivated by money and the Crime Stoppers' reward. After just 3 hours of deliberation, Christine Pila was found guilty. She was 17 at the time of the murders, which meant she was not eligible for the death penalty. But she was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 40 years. She will be eligible for parole in 2046 following the verdict. The community struggled to process the magnitude of the tragedy and the revelation that someone so close to the victims had been directly involved. Families of Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adalbert were left grappling with grief and the bitter reality of betrayal. Friends and classmates recalled the vibrant personalities of the 4 victims, how Tiffany and Rachel had been especially nurturing toward Christine, trying to protect her from years of bullying and ridicule. The betrayal cut deeply, as those who had been trusted and loved were implicated in the horrific events. Christine's sentencing marked a grim chapter in the town's history. Despite her youth at the time, the severity and premeditated nature of her actions ensured a lengthy prison term. Officials and psychologists highlighted how her history of abuse, addiction, and manipulation by Chris had played a role in her behavior, though the court emphasized personal responsibility and her voluntary participation in the murders in prison. Christine would face the challenge of serving decades behind bars, with the earliest possibility of parole decades away. Her story became a cautionary tale of how toxic relationships, unresolved trauma, and substance abuse can culminate in devastating violence for the families and community. The long path toward healing involved memorials, support groups, and advocacy against bullying and drug abuse. Rachel's father continued efforts to support crime victims, while friends and classmates established scholarships and community programs in memory of the young lives lost despite the passage of time. The Clear Lake murders remained a stark reminder of vulnerability, trust, and the devastating consequences of violence within what had seemed like an ordinary suburban community. The case also underscored the importance of thorough investigations, insurgency cooperation, and the critical role of witness testimony in solving complex crimes. It highlighted how one seemingly small act and anonymous tip could ultimately unravel a nearly 3-year mystery, bringing some measure of justice to the victims and their families. She will be 60 years old, more than 5 years after the murders back in July 2003. The families of the victims said that the guilty verdict allowed them to finally begin the long process of moving on with their lives. Christine has filed numerous appeals since her conviction, but every single one has been denied. Houston Police Sergeant Brian Harris said he believes Christine still does not fully accept responsibility for her actions. For her to truly come to grips with what she has done, he said, she has to acknowledge that there is a darkness in her soul. Christine's stepfather, Thomas, added, I'm very sorry for these families and their loss. The man who did this is dead. He was very, very bad a predator. My daughter is paying for someone else's sins. My daughter doesn't deserve this. My daughter is a victim too. It remains difficult to know exactly what happened that fateful afternoon and why. Police noted that there were 6 people present at the scene are now dead, and one refuses to speak with that. The full truth may never be completely known. The aftermath of that horrific day is still deeply felt. Rachel's father described it as an earthquake for both the families and the community, while Marcus' stepfather said, our lives are very different now. We see things differently than before, and we know that we will never again feel the sense of hope that we once had as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Crime Whispers. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware. Even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night, let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.